Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you an APS-C breakdown of the 350mm-ish options that I am comparing as a part of this series, including the Sony FE 50mm f1.4, and this is the Planar design with some, a Zeiss optical design to it. The second is also a similar kind of Sony Zeiss hybrid, the Sony FE 55mm f1.8, and this is a Sonnar design. And then finally, the upstart is the Samyang autofocusing 50mm f1.4 lens. Now, due to kind of a mix-up and then also a supply issue, I've had a break in between where I had to send back my review copy of the A7R Mark III and when my own personal copy arrived. And so as a result, I've gone ahead and proceeded and doing an APS-C kind of comparison on the Sony a6500. Since I plan to do that anyway, usually I kind of do the APS-C comparison at the end of the series. I'm going to throw it up front just to work within my schedule at this point. And I'm expecting Sony a7R III to arrive this next week, and so that'll allow me to move ahead with that project. So before we jump in and we start to look at results, I want to encourage you to watch past the early resolution section. In this video, we're going to look at a number of different things. We're going to look at kind of my wall comparison, which is at a short to medium distance, about 8 feet. And then we're going to do an infinity comparison. But after that, we're going to look at things beyond resolution. We're going to look at some of the rendering, some of the bokeh quality, chromatic aberrations, and you'll get a little bit more complete picture if you watch beyond just the resolution results. Because in this case, I don't think that it tells the full story of making a decision between these lenses, and I would encourage you to kind of stay tuned until the end. We'll come back together after we've looked at these images, and then we'll wrap things up. So remember, this is done on a 24 megapixel Sony a6500 body. These are all full frame lenses, but several of them at least, are ones that people will also consider that shoot APS-C. And so we'll take a look at the results and see what we find out. Okay, we're going to start. This is the APS-C comparison, and so we're starting by looking at the two 50mm f1.4 options. Now, as you can see, they do render color a little bit differently. In fact, all three of these lenses do, and so I just want to give you a look here. If I standardize the actual color information, and so this is the same white balance and settings. As you can see, the Sony lens, it trends a little bit cooler and maybe a little bit more neutral. The Samyang is a little bit warmer. It also has a little bit of a yellow or green tinge to it, and so and I think that I have seen that carry out in other images, as we'll see later on. So our comparison in the center, this is done on a 24 megapixel Sony a6500 APS-C. So as you can see in the middle of the frame, there's a pretty huge difference in resolution, but particularly in wide open contrast. And the 50mm f1.4 Planar is the most corrected lens of the bunch. We move out towards the edge, and we can see that the Planar lens is really delivering a pretty good edge-to-edge performance. It still has good contrast and sharpness out towards the edge of the frame, whereas the Samyang hasn't necessarily gotten a whole lot worse. If we just kind of scroll out this way, you can see it is getting mildly softer towards the edge of the frame, but not a whole lot. We also see that it seems to be maybe a little bit better on the right than it is on the left, but that also could be just how it's parallel to the wall. And so anyway, not a bad performance over on the right side. Okay, at f2, the Samyang looks a little bit better, but so does the far more expensive Sony lens that actually looks really fantastic. It looks fantastic out at the edge, it looks fantastic in the middle, and so we can see that here, kind of best case scenario on the Samyang, that it's definitely left behind by the more expensive optic. Now what we find between the two Sony options, and this is wide open before the kind of color balancing, we see that the 55mm trends cooler yet, and to where I would say it's moved out of the neutral zone and into more just general coolness, as we're going to see here. You see, even if we apply a custom white balance, equal to both of them, we see that it still does render a little bit differently. Now, if we take a look at the sharpness, remember this is f1.4 versus f1.8, and the framing isn't identical because one is a 55mm lens. As we can see, the more expensive Zeiss, Sony Zeiss 50mm f1.4 is sharper even at f1.4. The difference, contrast difference isn't quite as pronounced as it was between the Sony and the Samyang. We can also see here at the edge of the frame that these two lenses are, there's not a whole lot of difference. One is as good as the other, and over on the right side, I actually like the look of the 55mm a little bit different, and so it holds its own a little bit better. Now, if we compare it wide open to the Samyang here on the left, we can see that the, the Sony 55mm is a little bit sharper and more contrasty in the center of the frame. And then if we look over to the side, it's definitely stronger along the left side and also a little bit stronger on the right side. Now we can get a little closer to an apples to apples comparison here with both of them at f2, and if we look comparing here, I mean the 50mm 1.4 is fantastic at f2, and this, of course, the 55mm has only had the benefit of being stopped down a third of a stop, and so there's not really much of a difference there. And so at f2, the 50mm 1.4 gives a pretty fantastic showing. Now at f2.8 for both the Sony lenses, the 1.4 on the left, the 1.4 is bitingly sharp at f2.8. The 55mm is nice and sharp, and I think it only suffers by comparison to a truly exceptional lens wide open. And now we see that even on the edge, the f1.4 lens is looking superior. And even both sides are looking pretty consistent for it now. Now, if we compare it to the Samyang lens, the Samyang is a little bit closer, but you can tell that the Sony lens is just a little bit stronger. There in the center of the frame, towards the edge of the frame, it also has an edge on the left side and on the right side too. And so the Samyang is definitely the weakest at wide apertures of the three lenses. Now, if we compare the two f1.4 lenses at f5.6, we can see now that the Samyang is much, much closer. And, if not as strong, it's right there, enough so that in field use, I don't think that you would see this difference towards the center portion of the frame. And even out on the edge, it's a little bit behind in terms of contrast, but not by much, and so a pretty strong performance now at f5.6. So now if we compare the two Sony lenses, we're going to see that I would say that the 55mm is every bit as good here in the center of the frame at f5.6, and out towards the edge too, they're basically indistinguishable, except for the 55mm is maybe a hair stronger on the right side. Now, if we take things out to infinity, let's see what kind of result we get here. So this is again at f1.4, and obviously we're up against just the challenges of exposure here. And so, native exposure, this is what they would both look like, pretty blown out. And so, fortunately, because of a good sensor in the camera, I'm able to recover those down without too much damage to the image. Now, looking at the images globally, you can see there is still a difference in the color rendering between the Samyang and the Sony. Sony is cooler, and this is a taste thing. I'm not really going to comment on better or worse. Now, looking at them at a pixel level here at infinity, f1.4, and remember this is somewhat recovered because of bright conditions, and so it may not show either lens to its best, but once again you can see that the Sony has better contrast in the center of the frame here. Moving out towards the edge of the frame, frankly, neither one of them looks, fantastic in this kind of setting, but the Sony is a little bit stronger. And so you can see that really on either side. You can also see some fringing on the Samyang image that's not present on the Sony. And the Sony is, the 50mm 1.4 is really, really strong for controlling aberrations. Now, if we stop down to f2, we see a marked improvement for the Sony f1.4, and that's partly because, some of its sloppiness in the first shot, I think, has more to do with having to correct the image. In this case, you can just see that there's much more native contrast and resolution here, even at infinity f2, and that's true even if you look out towards the side here, where textures are rendered just with more precision, better contrast. And so at wide apertures, there's no question that the Sony is the sharper lens. And once again here, if you look at some of these aberrations that are present on the Samyang image, and they're just, perfectly corrected for on the Sony side. So, at infinity, I would say, if you're looking for sharpness and contrast, you get what you pay for here with the Sony lens. Now, if we bring the 55mm into the equation at f2, we find that there isn't a huge difference between the two. However, you can see that there's just a little bit of haziness at some of these edges on the 55mm that aren't there on the 1.4, and that's again due to having less aberrations. And looking out back towards this area, the aberrations are not as pronounced here on the 55mm as we saw on the Samyang, but we can also see that there's just a little bit more of a veiling that's due to a little bit of chromatic aberration that isn't present there on the f1.4 lens. And you can see here rendering and resolving really at infinity. You can just see that there is a difference between the two lenses. And once again, you get what you pay for, though the difference is not as pronounced with the 55mm, which retains a fairly strong performance out towards the edges of the frame. Now, if we stop on down to f4, we can see that the Samyang, some of the aberrations are clearing up, and so critical sharpness is coming up. Contrast still doesn't rival that of the f1.4 Sony, which still is resolving better at infinity. And again, there's a color difference there, and in this case, the Sony result is a little bit more accurate than that of the Samyang for this kind of scene. Snow isn't going to be this kind of slightly yellowish color. But at the same time, in terms of resolution, the Samyang is resolving fairly well at this point. It just it's not quite as good as the Sony. As we look back towards the center of the frame, you can still see there's just some three-dimensional pop that's there to the Sony f1.4 that's not there on the Samyang. Now, if we compare the 55mm now on the right, we can see that there really is not a whole lot of difference to be seen in terms of the contrast and resolution. It's still mildly better on the f1.4 lens, but really not enough to make a major difference. And if we come back here towards the foreground, we can see that actually here down in the corner, the 55mm looks every bit as good. In the center of the frame, I'm going to give an edge to the 1.4, but it's very close. Aberrations are basically gone on the 55mm, and it's giving a nice strong performance. Now here at f8, we can see that still the Samyang never really quite competes for absolute tack sharpness there on our original plane of focus out towards the edge here. Again, there's a clarity there that's never quite rendered on the Samyang lens. And here towards infinity, the Samyang, it doesn't look bad. It just doesn't look as good as the the more expensive lens from Sony. Now, once again, there's not a lot of difference between the 50mm and the 55mm. Here, stop down to f8. In the center of the frame, they both look really pretty fantastic off towards the edges of the frame. Both of them are looking very good here. And so, you know, I would say that the 55mm is the stronger performance compared to the Samyang. And of course, the premium lens here optically in resolving power is the 1.4 Sony. Now, this is not to say that the Samyang is an outright loser here, because the Samyang has a little less contrast and maybe a little bit less, and it definitely has some less sharpness. But for a lot of the ways that lenses like this will be used, it actually has pretty fantastic rendering and kind of a unique look to the images, partly due to that unique color signature that in some situations may be a strength rather than a weakness. But here, as I compare these, I purposely chose a scene that has a lot of varying depth of field objects. And so, number one, I want you to look at this autofocus area on the wall, which is the softest on the Samyang, even compared to the more expensive Sony. Now, if we look at our plane of focus, both of these were manually focused, you know, with live view focus, and so we could get as good a focus as possible. So we can see that there's definitely a little bit more sharpness and contrast and less fringing here on the Sony side compared to the Samyang. That's the strength there for the Sony. As we move out of focus, however, ironically, I mean, both of them have some green fringing here. And in the closer plane of field, the Samyang is not as well corrected as what the Sony is. When you move towards complete out of focus, there's not really much of a difference. I also noted over on this side that the kind of the softest bokeh circles, less hard edges, are actually on the Samyang. And so it all comes down to your shooting priorities. If your shooting priorities are bokeh quality, the Samyang is actually really nice. Now, if we were to compare the 55mm here on the left with the Samyang here on the right, we can see that definitely in this area it's a little bit busier on the 55mm. Both of these are at f2, so we can standardize results here. And as you can see, both of them look pretty equal on the plane of focus there. And if we kind of look at some of these green fringed areas, it's ever so slightly more pronounced on the Samyang, but there's not a big difference between the two. Looking over at kind of some of our bokeh softness areas, we can see that still our softest results are coming out of the Samyang here on the right side. Now here too, if we compare the two f1.4 options, we can see, looking at the image globally, that they really look pretty similar. And once again, the Samyang is the softest here on kind of the hard edges. This is a lamp behind, and you can see some kind of defined lines there that are just softer looking on the Samyang. So, I mean, Samyang is really nice for the overall rendering of the lens. And so again, it's about your priorities. If your priority is critical sharpness at wide apertures, I mean, the Sony is a clear winner here. The Samyang result just looks a little bit veiled and soft by comparison. It's not bad, but when you have it side by side with the, you know, amazing contrast out of the Sony 1.4, it just highlights that difference. Now, if we compare the 55mm with the Samyang, we can see that once again, Samyang is definitely going to win in terms of soft edges. And in terms of the overall sharpness and contrast, it's not as pronounced as it was with the 50mm 1.4, but definitely the Sony is still the winner here in terms of contrast and sharpness. Okay, one final test here. How about rendering of faces and skin tones, you know, all of that kind of thing for portraiture? Looking at the image globally, we can see that, I mean, I don't know that there's necessarily a clear winner. You can make your own evaluation there. I will note that we've got a little bit softer bokeh circle here, out of focused area from the Samyang. So once again, you know, that's the strength there. Now the strength for the Sony here is, you know, you can see beautiful, even at f1.4, we've got beautiful sharpness, beautiful clarity. And if you look at the out of focus eye, you can see that green fringing, some of these aberrations that are present on the Samyang, just not there on the 1.4 Sony. Now looking at skin tones, there's definitely more micro contrast on the Sony. Skin is a little bit softer on the Samyang, and so again, that's, if you're looking at it for portrait purposes, this is not a bad result here, and might give you some nice options in terms of of getting nice skin tones and a nice result if critical sharpness is not your priority. Now, if we compare the 55mm with the 50mm, we find that, again, those differences aren't quite as pronounced. There is definitely still more contrast on the f1.4 lens, and we can see why. If we go over here, we can see there's some just some aberrations that are not corrected on the 55mm that are corrected on the 50mm. And again, once again, skin tones are, there's more micro contrast in the skin on the 1.4 lens. But again, either a strength or weakness depending on your priorities. So as you can see, there is a fairly clear standout in terms of absolute correction, absolute resolution and contrast. And in some ways, at least from what I can tell on APS-C, the Sony Zeiss 50mm f1.4 planar lens is one of the best corrected 50mm options that I've seen. And it is delivering stunning results even on APS-C. A really amazing lens, to be sure. It's also heavy and it's expensive, and what you're seeing there is that the Samyang, for example, it's far less sharp. It has far less contrast in an absolute sense. But there will be those for whom that really doesn't matter all that much. What they're most interested in is great quality rendering, and they want a lens that is going to produce really soft bokeh, give them very nice portrait results. And they don't even necessarily want absolute critical sharpness. And so for some people, as we saw this lens, it may be a fantastic choice for them. And then basically right there in the middle is the 55mm f1.8 Sonnar lens. And you can tell why this lens is a really, really popular option. It delivers, image quality that, while it's not quite as good as the planar lens, it's fairly close, and particularly on the edges of the frame, it has a very even sharpness profile. It's not as perfectly corrected, but it's nicely corrected and delivers really nice results in a very small, convenient package, which of course makes it the favorite for APS-C shooters for that very reason. And so stay tuned, and we'll jump in and follow this up with the full frame results. I'm also going to give you just some of my feedback on focus results and focus sound. I'll do that probably on the full frame system, but it'll be equally applicable here to APS-C as well if you're an APS shooter. And so stay tuned whether you're a full frame or an APS-C shooter for the remainder of this series. In the meantime, if you look in the description down below, I've got ongoing image galleries from each of these lenses that I'm adding to, and there's also buying links if you're interested in purchasing one for yourself. You can become one of my patrons and follow me on social media. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.